Right now, hundreds of planes are flying in this tiny area. It's a place where Western airlines are banned from flying north of this region in Russia and Ukraine, while to the south, one of the largest conflicts in years has closed the airspaces of countries like Iran, which has made connecting the world's largest economies and population centers by air a lot more fragile, where one incident can shut down this airspace. Yet airlines have chosen to route their most critical flights through this region. So I want to show you why, how we got here, who wins and loses with this shrinking air bridge between East and West, and perhaps most importantly, what might happen, what the world could look like if it closes. So this is the story behind the last air bridge between East and West. Now, a good place to start might be the 1920s with the formation of the Soviet Union and what would arguably become the world's most important airspace with Siberia. Obviously, during this era before World War II, airlines weren't really leveraging this airspace, especially in places like Siberia. But the important thing to note is that this airspace over the Soviet Union was mostly open. This was also true in the Middle East, where airlines and governments were opening up airports in places like Cairo and Karachi so that they could connect a place like the UK to a colony like India or a former one like Australia, which would become part of a much more lucrative air bridge. Now, fast forward to World War II and perhaps more importantly, the Cold War, and the Soviet Union and China had effectively closed off their airspaces to Western airlines to project power. So airlines like BOAC, one of the predecessors to British Airways, got creative by having stopovers in more friendly countries like Egypt, Pakistan, India, to get to places like Hong Kong, which still took days despite planes being able to fly faster and further. Speaking of getting to places, that's what Bilt is really good for. Over the past 3 years, I've been using Bilt to rack up points through rent payments, so it's pretty cool when they reached out. Now, you probably rent or have a mortgage, so you can also earn points through Bilt wherever you live, where you can then redeem those points towards things like flights, hotels, workout classes, Amazon, even future rent payments or student loans. Bilt is not only rolling out a neighborhood concierge program where you can make rent or mortgage payments, but where it will make reservations for restaurants or fitness classes for you. This program will even book flights, hotels, lifts, while offering exclusive benefits for Bilt members. It knows your neighborhood. I mean, the neighborhood concierge program is connected to over 45,000 partners across the US, and suggestions will only get better over time as you share more with Bilt. Try it out for yourself and start earning Bilt points right now by using the link in the description or on the QR code here, and make sure you use that link so Bilt knows I sent you. Demand was also skyrocketing thanks to cheap fuel, which made flights more affordable even for the middle class who could see family on the other side of the world or to pursue a better life. And this made a country like Iran, which sat in the middle between East and West, quite powerful. So now hopefully you can see this sort of air bridge that is forming between East and West, which is becoming more important. But now it's the 70s, and Richard Nixon became the first president to visit Beijing and Moscow, and now Western airlines like BOAC could fly through Siberian airspace to get to cities like Tokyo. So it's like the Cold War kinda cooled off a little, which is sorta insane. Like, why would the Soviets allow this? Well, that's kinda complicated, right? But the Soviets, instead of banning their airspace, they started leveraging it. Since pretty much every major country had a national airline, making aviation very visible, the Soviets likely saw their airspace as a sort of negotiating tactic and a way for them to appear more open to the West without opening their borders. And the Soviets wanted more ways to make money, so having access to Western currencies was pretty lucrative for them. And for an airline like BOAC, they could save a ton of money on fuel while becoming this prestigious airline that had access to Siberian airspace when pretty much every other Western airline didn't have this. That is, the Soviets would charge foreign airlines something called navigation or overflight fees, something that pretty much all other countries do, but something that the Soviets and later the Russians would be known for more than anyone else. But if the Soviets opened up their airspace too much to the West, then it could show that they were desperate while also posing a potential security risk. So most Western airlines weren't able to fly over Soviet airspace, including airlines like BOAC, where it was just limited to a few routes, which meant that for airlines to grow their networks across East and West, they continued to rely on the Middle East, which was even true during a long 8-year conflict between Iran and Iraq, where airlines largely continued flying through these countries despite the conflict. Well, I should say it depends. For Iraqi airspace, airlines generally avoided it throughout the war. For Iran, it was a little bit more complicated. It depended on exactly what airline or what time period, but there was still some activity over their airspace. So now it's the 90s, and obviously there's way more flights as demand grew and technology got better. Oh, and airlines like Emirates were forming, but they're pretty small at this point, so we'll get back to them. Perhaps the most important change was when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, giving Western airlines a lot more access to what would be now called Russian airspace, which was becoming quite open to Western airlines for the first time pretty much ever, and was one of the most visible signs that Russia was willing to work with the West. The fall of the Soviet Union also created newly independent countries like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, which would have their own airspaces and would become a central piece of this story, or the central piece. But for now, many Western airlines could fly in this region, including some of the world's former longest routes, like Newark to Hong Kong on Continental Airlines, a route that basically relied on Russian airspace to survive. But then,
breaking news right now, Russia has attacked Ukraine, marking the start of a new war in Eastern Europe.
We are reporting tonight from a country fighting for its survival. New satellite imagery just in tonight appears to show hundreds of Russian military vehicles in a convoy heading towards Kyiv.
So after Russia invaded Ukraine, the West responded by banning Russian airlines and aircraft in their airspace. Russia, of course, responded in kind, banning Western airlines from flying through Russian airspace. European airlines suddenly faced massive detours, especially to places like Southeast Asia, where they had to fly through this shrinking airbridge. And many routes that had been flying for decades suddenly became uneconomical, especially with the fuel prices spiking because of the war. Not even Beijing, a market that Lufthansa and British Airways had flown for decades, worked, even though it could still fly through this narrow corridor. No route was immune from being cut. While airlines had already avoided eastern Ukraine since 2014, when a Malaysian Airlines plane was shot down the same year that Russia annexed Crimea, it was going to be even harder for airlines to fly between east and west without Ukraine's massive airspace. And as for the routes that remained, they only had one alternative: fly as close to Ukraine and Russia as possible, specifically through Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Caspian Sea, before going further west to places like Korea or Japan, or going south through Iran to get to places like India and the rest of Southeast Asia. Though that wasn't always straightforward. See what I did there? No? Okay. Something very similar happened to the Malaysian Airlines incident. In 2020, a Ukrainian commercial jet was shot down after departing from Tehran. So after this point, airlines had to be very careful when it came to flying through the airspace. They had to make a decision on whether to save fuel and fly through the airspace or pay a higher premium when it came to insurance. And yes, this all happened when there wasn't even a war, and while some Western airlines like Lufthansa continued to fly into Tehran. Okay, so that's how we got here, and I know, there's a lot missing. But Iran's airspace is still closed as the war is going on, and this is, so far, indefinite. And unlike before, where airlines could fly through Russian or Ukrainian airspace, they don't really have alternatives. And this airspace became even more important, where not only Western airlines from Europe relied on it, but for flights to North America as well. Even the world's longest flight from New York to Singapore flies over this airspace as of early 2026, which is a route that normally flies over Siberia. Which begs the question, is anyone winning here? Clearly the airlines don't like it. They're paying more in fuel, which is a cost that is often passed down, but not everyone can afford that, so routes get cut, making the world less connected. But that's not the full story, because some airlines do have access to Russian airspace, like Chinese airlines and the Middle Eastern carriers, and it's something that the Western airlines don't necessarily like. But on the other hand, with all this new volume of flights flying over these little countries like Georgia, they must love this, because even though their land area is small, they're making a lot more money on navigation fees than they ever did. But perhaps a bigger question is, how stable is this airspace? And if it closes, are there still any winners? We need to try to answer these questions because Russia and Iran literally borders these countries. The most important thing here is that if any of these conflicts expand, it's going to affect these countries because they are literally right between both of these areas. So part of the answer is obvious. If this air bridge closes, then connectivity between East and West will fall apart and airfares will rise dramatically. We've already seen part of this when the Gulf airlines like Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar had their issues when their airspaces were closed. Which, by the way, means that even if this airspace closes in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the surrounding area, we still have the rest of the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, which historically has been pretty stable, and is pretty much an air bridge of its own. I mean, maybe you can even kind of see it on the screen behind me. And the Gulf airlines will benefit the most from this because they have the infrastructure, 3 airports, Doha, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi, serving as hubs that conveniently connects East and West. No other airline can take advantage of this like these airlines can. So if the conflict expands and lasts longer, then we'll probably have bigger issues, where really the only way to connect between East and West might even be like going from Europe to North America. Not ideal, but the world is probably going to be in a different place if it gets to that point. And if it does, then the real important thing is that situations can't happen anymore. People who want to see their loved ones for the last time can't do that, and people who want to pursue a new life can't do that either.